Thank you. I have never been in Slovenia before physically, but I feel that I've been here in spirit for a long time. I've had a close attachment to Slovenia ever since I met Vlado Dedije 40 years ago, and we became and remained close friends. I learned a good deal about his extraordinary life and had the privilege of taking part in a few of his struggles for human rights and justice in his long lifetime of remarkable courage and achievement. And because of people like Vlado over many centuries, by comparative and historical standards, we are now fortunate to enjoy great freedom. Freedom offers opportunity. Opportunity confers responsibility. Responsibility to use the freedom we enjoy wisely, honestly, and humanely. We cannot hope to do so unless we're willing to face truths that may be uncomfortable. So let me mention a few that would be on the front pages right now in societies that valued the freedom they enjoy, but that are kept under a veil of silence in the West. A few days ago, we should have commemorated the 25th anniversary of the assassination of Archbishop Oscar Romero of El Salvador, and shortly before that, the 15th anniversary of the murder of 6 leading Latin American intellectuals, Jesuit priests. These two events frame the hideous decade of the 1980s in Central America, where the U.S. waged or supported vicious terrorist wars directed in large part against the Church. The Latin American Church had committed a grave crime. It had undertaken what the bishops called the preferential option for the poor. Priests, nuns, lay workers were reading the Gospels with poor peasants and helping them to organize, to escape from misery and bitter repression. Archbishop Romero was known as the voice for the voiceless, the Jesuit intellectuals as well. And punishment was swift and terrible. The Archbishop and the Jesuits were assassinated by security forces armed and trained by Washington. In fact, the present incumbents in Washington or their immediate mentors. The United Nations Truth Commissions that finally surveyed the wreckage concluded that the same forces were responsible not only for these murders, but for the vast majority of other crimes in the region, including hundreds of thousands killed, horrifying torture, every other imaginable crime. The Archbishop was assassinated while performing Mass shortly after he had written to President Carter, pleading with him not to send aid to the military junta that ruled El Salvador because, in his words, it will surely sharpen the repression that has been unleashed against the people's organizations fighting to defend their most fundamental human rights. State terror escalated, always with U.S. support and Western silence and complicity. If anything remotely similar had happened in Eastern Europe in those years, the events would be known and the anniversaries would have been commemorated. The differentiating principle is crystal clear. Our crimes do not exist. We must not remember the grim fate of those who were fighting to defend their most fundamental human rights, and we must scrupulously evade our responsibility for those crimes. Unfortunately, that's probably a historical universal among the powerful. A few weeks ago, Washington appointed its first director of intelligence services, John Negroponte. In the 1980s, he was the ambassador to Honduras, running the largest CIA station in the world. His task was to supervise the military bases on Honduras for the CIA mercenary army attacking Nicaragua. If Nicaragua had adopted Western norms, it would have responded with terrorist activities in the United States. Instead, it appealed to the World Court, which condemned Washington for unlawful use of force. In lay terms, that means international terrorism, and ordered the U.S. government to terminate the crimes and pay substantial reparations, which would more than cover the huge debt that is strangling Nicaragua as a result of the war. With the silent support of its Western allies, the leader of the free world dismissed the court with contempt, vetoed 2 Security Council resolutions supporting the court's judgment, and proceeded to escalate the war, which was no small operation. Nicaragua was virtually destroyed. The death toll in per capita equivalent terms would be 2.5 million in the United States, more than all deaths in all U.S. wars in its history. By now, 60% of young children suffer severe malnutrition and probable brain damage. A large part of the workforce is abroad, sending remittances on which the country barely survives, much as in El Salvador. There has been virtually no reaction in the West to the appointment of a condemned international terrorist to the top counterterrorism position in the world. Orwell would not have known whether to laugh or weep. We should know what to do, however, at least those of us who hope to live in a decent world. Unfortunately, it is all too easy to continue. Those who cannot fill in the blanks have a good deal to learn about the real world. And unless they do, the future of human society is not bright. I will, however, put that aside and turn to the more general question of the resort to force in international affairs and how its legitimacy has been understood over time. The unspeakable crimes of the 20th century led to dedicated efforts to save humans from the curse of war. And the word save is no exaggeration. Surely, since it became clear in 1945 that the likelihood of ultimate doom is well beyond what any rational person would be willing to tolerate. The phrase ultimate doom is not mine. I'm borrowing it from 2 prominent strategic analysts writing in the very sober and respectable Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. They conclude that Washington's current military programs and aggressive stance, quoting, carry an appreciable risk of ultimate doom. The threat is enhanced significantly as the radical nationalists of the Bush administration are extending Clinton's doctrine of control of space for military purposes to their more extreme concept of what they call ownership of space, which may mean instant engagement anywhere in the world. Quoting, By pursuing to the extreme limits the traditional concept that expansion is the path to security, I'll return to that, they're putting any part of the world at risk of instant destruction thanks to sophisticated global surveillance and lethal weaponry in space. And they're endangering the United States as well. The same authors that I quoted continue, pointing out that the terrifying technology now being developed in the transformation of the military will assuredly diffuse to the rest of the world, and in the context of competition in intimidation, the action-reaction cycle creates rising danger, potentially an unmanageable one, of course, for Americans as well. The authors express the hope that the threat that the United States government is posing will be countered by a coalition of peace-loving states led by China. We have come to a pretty pass when such thoughts are expressed at the heart of the establishment, and what that implies about the state of Western democracy is no less shocking. As had been predicted, one consequence of the aggressive militarism of the reactionary nationalists in Washington was to drive Russia, and by now China, to significant expansion of offensive military capacities, posing a serious threat to the world, even accidental war when automated response systems fail, as they regularly do. A related and very serious concern, which has been discussed in the technical literature well before the 9/11 terrorist atrocities, is that nuclear weapons may sooner or later fall into the hands of terrorist groups. These grim prospects are also being enhanced by the Bush administration aggressive militarism. One of its consequences is that Russia is transferring nuclear weapons across its vast territory to counter mounting U.S. threats. Prominent U.S. strategic analysts point out that terrorists may steal such weapons as Russia shuttles them from one place to another between deployment fields and factories in an effort to counter the growing U.S. threats. And they point out that that could spell disaster for an American city. But there's even a much worse threat, they point out, from this nuclear gamesmanship. Now quoting, "The seizure of a ready-to-fire strategic long-range nuclear missile or a group of missiles capable of delivering bombs to targets thousands of miles away could be apocalyptic for entire nations. All of this constitutes what they call an accident waiting to happen." These dangers are being consciously escalated by the threat and use of violence, which, as predicted, is stimulating nuclear proliferation, along with the jihadi terrorism that traces back to Reagan administration programs to organize, arm, and train radical Islamists, not for the defense of Afghanistan, as was proclaimed, but for the more usual reasons of state. The invasion of Iraq is a case in point. It was undertaken with the expectation that it would probably increase the threat of terror. Among many others, that was also predicted by U.S. intelligence agencies in their report to the President a few weeks before the invasion. And the predictions came true. The conclusions are also confirmed by U.S. intelligence. Its most recent analysis concludes that the invasion of Iraq created a new terrorist haven and a training area for terrorists who will disperse around the world, replacing the Afghan havens that were established at first by the Reagan administration and its allies in Britain and Pakistan. The official reason for the invasion of Iraq was that it was developing weapons of mass destruction. The U.S. and Britain therefore proclaimed the right to invade in what's called anticipatory self-defense. That was the single question, as stressed constantly by Bush, Blair, and other high officials. Well, as is well known, there were no weapons of mass destruction, apart from what had been produced in the 1980s, thanks to aid provided by the United States and Britain, along with others, aid that continued long after Saddam's worst atrocities and after the end of the war with Iran. After the U.S. invasion in 2003, there was sophisticated, massive looting of the installations that had been constructed in the 1980s. That includes high-precision equipment capable of making parts for chemical and nuclear weapons and missiles. Prior to the invasion, these sites had been monitored by UN inspectors who have since been kept out of the country, while the occupation forces left them unguarded. Where this huge mass of equipment has gone, no one knows, and it's uncomfortable to guess. The ironies are almost inexpressible. The United States and Britain invaded to prevent the use of weapons of mass destruction that did not exist, and it succeeded in providing the terrorists it helped to mobilize with the means to develop weapons of mass destruction, which they did not have before. There are many other illustrations of the willingness of top planners to risk increase of international terrorism, which could have awesome consequences. It's not, of course, that they welcome terrorism. Rather, it is simply not a high priority in comparison with other objectives, such as controlling the world's major energy resources. One of the more astute of the senior planners and analysts, Zbigniew Brzezinski, recently pointed out that the occupation of Iraq gives the United States what he called critical leverage over its European and Asian rivals. He was reiterating the conclusions of leading planners after World War II, who recognized that control of what they called the stupendous source of strategic power in the Gulf region would give the United States veto power over its industrial rivals, quoting George Kennan in this case. It's a rational calculation on the assumption that human survival is not particularly significant in comparison with power and wealth. And that is nothing new. These themes resonate through history. The difference today is only that the stakes are enormously higher. In 1945, the efforts to end the curse of war led to a consensus on the principles that should guide state action, formalized in the United Nations Charter. That consensus was reiterated last December by a high-level UN panel, which included the National Security Advisor for George Bush I. The panel reaffirmed the conditions of the Charter, that force can be deployed only when authorized by the Security Council or in defense against armed attack until the Security Council acts. Any other resort to force is a war crime, in fact, the supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes in that it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole, in the words of the Nuremberg Tribunal. The December 2004 panel concluded that these conditions should be neither rewritten nor reinterpreted. The panel then adds the following statement. It says, "For those impatient with such a response, the answer must be that in a world full of perceived potential threats, the risk to global order and the norm of non-intervention on which it continues to be based is simply too great for the legality of unilateral preventive action as distinct from collectively endorsed action to be accepted. Allowing one to so act is to allow all." That last sentence presupposes a principle that's the foundation of every moral code that merits even the slightest attention, the principle of universality. Namely, we apply to ourselves the same standards that we do to others, if not more stringent ones. But that principle is flatly rejected in the intellectual, moral, and political culture of the most powerful states, again raising the prospect of ultimate doom. The United Nations panel was responding directly to many years of enthusiastic support by Western intellectuals for the resort to force by their own states on alleged humanitarian grounds. That's another very familiar theme throughout history, including the worst monsters. In the last years of the last millennium, across the spectrum of elite opinion, there was a claim, I'm now quoting, there was a claim for the idealistic new world bent on ending inhumanity, which had entered a noble phase of its foreign policy with a saintly glow. For the first time in history, a state is dedicated to principles and values, acting from altruism and moral fervor alone as the leader of the enlightened states, hence free to resort to force for what its leaders determine to be right. That is a small sample of an extraordinary deluge drawn only from the most respected liberal voices. These declarations, in Europe as well, I should say, these declarations reflect elite perceptions, but not those of the general public. A large majority of the American public continue to take the position that states are entitled to use force, I'm quoting, if there is strong evidence that the country is in imminent danger of being attacked. So a large majority reject the bipartisan consensus on so-called preemptive war and agree with the recent United Nations panel, and incidentally also agree with the former non-aligned movement, the governments of 80% of the world's population, but they are, of course, ignored or dismissed with derision. The legitimacy of the use of force is not the only issue on which public opinion in the United States diverges sharply from elite political culture. To take another current example, which also raises issues of survival, it's commonly reported that the United States refused to join the Kyoto Treaty a month ago. That's true only if the phrase United States excludes its population, who overwhelmingly support ratification of the treaty, so enthusiastically, in fact, that a majority of Bush voters believe that he agreed with them that the United States should join. Large majorities also believe that the United States should accept the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court and the World Court, and should rely on the United Nations to take the lead in international crises, including issues of security, reconstruction, and political transition in Iraq. Most of the population even believe that the United States should abandon the Security Council veto, accepting majority rule. And that's true on other issues. Large majorities believe that the United States should rely on diplomatic and economic measures more than military ones in the so-called war on terror, and overwhelming majorities, as in the past, favor increased government spending on health care, education, other social spending. All of this is in sharp opposition to public policy. Studies revealing these facts were released by the most prestigious institutions that monitor public attitudes shortly before the November 2004 presidential elections. Plainly, they are of critical importance to functioning democracy. The studies reveal that both political parties are far to the right of the population on many of the most crucial issues. They were scarcely reported, not mentioned in the national press. These observations, unfortunately, generalized, lending further weight to the judgment of the strategic analysts I quoted earlier about the crisis of Western democracy, a crisis so serious that they are turning to China to rescue us from disaster. Washington's unilateral resort to force was articulated publicly by the Bush administration in its national security strategy of September 2002, breaking no new ground, however. Even before the 2000 election, Condoleezza Rice, writing in Foreign Affairs, the main establishment journal, condemned what she called the reflexive appeal to notions of international law and norms, and the belief that the support of many states, or even better of institutions like the United Nations, is essential to the legitimate exercise of power. That, she says, is completely wrong, referring, of course, to exercise of power by the United States. The usual exception prevails. This extremist position has long been conventional among the powerful. And to illustrate, I'll just keep to the liberal end of the spectrum in the United States. To take one case, elder statesman and Kennedy advisor Dean Acheson informed the American Society of International Law in 1963 that no legal issue arises when the United States responds to a challenge to its position, power, and prestige. He was speaking shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought the world to the brink of nuclear war a few months earlier, as a result in large part of U.S. international terrorism. Turning to the 1990s, the Clinton doctrine was that the United States has the right, I'm quoting it now, to resort to unilateral use of military power to defend vital interests, such as ensuring uninhibited access to key markets, energy supplies, and strategic resources, that is, even without the pretexts that Bush and Blair devised. Taken literally, the Clinton doctrine is more expansive than Bush's national security strategy, which aroused enormous fear and concern around the world, and elicited very harsh criticism even within the foreign policy establishment in the United States. The Clinton doctrine, in contrast, was barely noticed, and the international affairs literature makes the difference clear. It was explained by Clinton's Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, also writing in Foreign Affairs. She pointed out that every president has a doctrine like the Bush Doctrine in his back pocket, but it is simply foolish to smash people in the face with it and to implement it in a manner that will infuriate even allies. That is, a little tact is useful. It's not good form to declare that there is no United Nations. When the United States leads, the United Nations will follow. When it suits our interests to do so, we will do so. When it does not suit our interests, we will not. Or perhaps it is good form. Those words are John Bolton's. He's Washington's newly appointed ambassador to the United Nations. Elite attitudes on the use of force receive an illuminating expression in the scholarly literature. One of the leading American historians, John Lewis Gaddis of Yale University, recently published a highly regarded book that examines the historical roots of Bush's preemptive war doctrine, which he basically supports with the usual reservations about style and tactics. Gaddis traces the doctrine to one of his intellectual heroes, the grand strategist John Quincy Adams. Gaddis refers specifically to the justifications that Adams provided for Andrew Jackson's conquest of Spanish Florida in what's called the First Seminole War in 1818, when Adams was Secretary of State. He later became president. The war was justified in self-defense, Adams argued, and Gaddis agrees. Self-defense against what Adams called runaway Negroes and lawless Indians who lived in land that the United States coveted. Adams understood that expansion is the path to security. Gaddis writes, a doctrine now extended to the whole world by Bush. All presidents, Gaddis explains, recognized that America's security was threatened by failed states, dangerous power vacuums that the U.S. should fill to guarantee its own security, from Florida in 1818 to Iraq in 2003. Gaddis is a highly competent historian, and he cites the right historical scholarly sources. Primarily, historian William Earl Weeks wrote the major work on the Seminole War, but he omits what they say, and we learn a lot by looking more closely. Weeks describes in lurid detail, what follows is almost entirely quotes, he describes Jackson's exhibition of murder and plunder in the First Seminole War, which was just another phase in his project of removing or eliminating Native Americans from the Southeast. Florida was a problem because it had not yet been incorporated into the expanding American empire, in the terminology of the Founding Fathers, and because it was a haven for Indians and escaped slaves. Jackson embarked on a campaign of terror, devastation, and intimidation, destroying villages and sources of food in a calculated effort to inflict starvation on the tribes who sought refuge from his wrath in the swamps. And so matters continued, leading to a famous state paper in which Adams endorsed Jackson's unprovoked aggression to establish in Florida the dominion of this republic upon the odious basis of violence and bloodshed. These are the words of the Spanish ambassador, but Weeks writes that they are a painfully precise description. Continuing, Weeks writes, Adams had consciously distorted, dissembled, and lied about the goals and conduct of American foreign policy to both Congress and the public, grossly violating his proclaimed moral principles implicitly defending Indian removal, slavery, and the use of military force without congressional approval. The crimes of Jackson and Adams proved but a prelude to a second war of extermination against the Seminoles, in which the remnants either fled to the west to enjoy the same fate later, or were killed or forced to take refuge in the dense swamps of Florida. Weeks adds that Adams also established the presidential rhetoric of empire, designed to marshal public as well as congressional support for its policies. This, he says, is a durable and essential aspect of American diplomacy, inherited and elaborated by successive generations of American statesmen, but fundamentally unchanged over time. The rhetorical framework rests on three pillars: the assumption of the unique moral value of the United States, the assertion of its mission to redeem the world by spreading its professed ideals and the so-called American way of life, and the faith in the nation's divinely ordained destiny. The theological framework reduces policy issues to a choice between good and evil, thus undercutting reasoned debate and fending off the dread threat of democracy. The critics can be dismissed as anti-American, an interesting concept borrowed from the lexicon of totalitarianism. Filling in these and many other instructive omissions, the picture provided by Gaddis's scholarly sources lends considerable support to his judgment about the precedents for the Bush doctrine and its implementation, from Adams through so-called Wilsonian idealism and on to the present. As for the expansion of the precedents to the entire world, others may judge for themselves, and they have. Fear and often hatred of the United States has risen to unprecedented heights, significantly increasing the threat of terror, another outcome that was anticipated, and also the likelihood of ultimate doom. At the margins, we do find more nuanced opinions on the resort to force. One of the most important is the International Independent Commission of Inquiry on the Kosovo War, which was headed by the distinguished South African juror, Justice Richard Goldstone. The commission concluded that the NATO bombing was illegal but legitimate. It was in gross violation of the fundamental principles of international law, but they concluded it was legitimate because all diplomatic avenues had been exhausted and there was no other way to stop the killings and atrocities in Kosovo. Justice Goldstone concluded that the United Nations Charter may need revision in the light of the report of the commission he headed, because the NATO bombing is too important a precedent to be disregarded. Note that that's the conclusion that was rejected by the UN panel that reviewed this and other cases. Goldstone also stressed the need for what he called objective analysis, which is good advice. One question that objective analysis might address is whether indeed all diplomatic options had been exhausted in Kosovo. When NATO decided to bomb, there were two diplomatic options on the table, a NATO proposal and a Serbian proposal. After 78 days of bombing, a compromise was reached between them, although NATO instantly violated it. Fanatics on both sides know whether diplomatic options were available. Those of us who are restricted to evidence can only conclude that there may well have been diplomatic options. A second question is whether There was no other way to stop the killings and atrocities in Kosovo, as the Independent Commission asserts, clearly a crucial matter. Here, objective analysis happens to be unusually easy. There is a vast documentary record from impeccable Western sources, the U.S. State Department, the British Parliament, NATO, the OSCE, and others. All reach the same conclusion. Overwhelmingly, the killings and atrocities followed the bombing. There is an extensive literature on this topic, from media to scholarship, and in it, the documentation is almost universally ignored, and the chronology is reversed so that the bombing is presented as a reaction to the atrocities to which it led. I've reviewed that dismal record elsewhere, and will put it aside here. The consequences of the bombing certainly came as no surprise. They were predicted at once by NATO Commander General Wesley Clark quite publicly. The Clinton administration also anticipated the crimes that followed the bombing, as General Clark confirms in more detail in his memoirs. And it's hard to imagine that other NATO authorities were more deluded. Kosovo was an ugly place before the NATO bombing, though regrettably not by international standards. According to the major Western sources, about 2,000 people were killed in the year prior to the invasion, many of them killed by Albanian KLA guerrillas attacking Serbs from Albania in an effort, as they announced, to elicit a harsh Serbian response that could rally Western opinion to their cause. The British government makes the astonishing claim that until January 1999, most of the killings were the responsibility of the KLA guerrillas attacking from Albania, and the rich Western documentation reveals that nothing substantial changed until the NATO bombing 2 months later. One of the few scholarly studies even to consider these matters estimates that Serbs were responsible for 500 of the 2,000 killed. This is the careful and judicious study by Nicholas Wheeler, British scholar, who supports the NATO bombing on the grounds that there would have been worse atrocities if NATO had not bombed. So the argument is that by bombing at a time when most atrocities were attributed to KLA guerrillas, and with the anticipation that the bombing would lead to far worse atrocities, NATO was preventing atrocities. The fact that these are the strongest arguments that can be contrived by serious analysts, I stress serious, tells us a good deal about the decision to bomb, particularly when we recall that there apparently were diplomatic options. Kosovo is one of the two great achievements that were brought forth to give retrospective proof that for the first time in history, states were observing principles and values under the guidance of their Anglo-American tutors, as Václav Havel proclaimed, and that the UN Charter must be revised to allow the West to carry out so-called humanitarian intervention. The other example was East Timor. That example is truly atrocious. That it can even be brought up without shame is a remarkable comment on Western intellectual culture, and here almost the entire West is complicit, though the U.S.-British role is the worst. That too is extensively discussed in print, so I'll skip it, along with some other recent examples that merit discussion, and I think lead to the same conclusions. One case that can hardly be ignored is the Bush-Blair invasion of Iraq, justified solely by Iraq's refusal to obey Security Council orders to stop developing weapons of mass destruction, as Washington and London constantly stressed. After the collapse of these pretexts, we were informed that the justification was not anticipatory self-defense, as had been solemnly proclaimed, but rather Bush's messianic vision to bring democracy to the world, as the new version was described without irony by liberal commentators. The reaction to this sudden conversion was interesting. It ranged from rapturous awe to critical commentary, which praised the nobility and generosity of the vision, but warned that it may be beyond our means. The beneficiaries may be too backward. It might prove too costly. That this has been the guiding vision is presupposed throughout as self-evident. It's very hard to find an exception within the mainstream. All that was missing was evidence. Evidently, the declarations of the leadership suffice, and a mass of counter-evidence up to the present can be dismissed as irrelevant, rather in the manner of North Korea. The strongest witnesses for the defense should be the leading scholars and most enthusiastic advocates of what is called democracy promotion. The most prominent among them is the director of the Democracy and Rule of Law Project at the Carnegie Endowment, Thomas Carothers. He has just published a book reviewing the record of democracy promotion since the end of the Cold War. He's a strong advocate of this policy. He finds what he calls a strong line of continuity running through all administrations, quoted, where democracy appears to fit in well with U.S. security and economic interests, the United States promotes democracy. Where democracy clashes with other significant interests, it is downplayed or even ignored. All administrations, he says, are schizophrenic in this regard, with curious consistency. And he predicts with regret that Iraq policies will likely exhibit similar contradictions between stated principles and political reality. Well, it did not take long for his prediction to be fulfilled. The occupation authorities, U.S. and Britain, worked hard to prevent the threat of democracy in Iraq, but they were compelled with great reluctance to permit elections. That is a major triumph of nonviolent resistance, mass nonviolent resistance, for which Ayatollah Sistani is a symbol. Few competent observers would disagree with the editors of the world's leading business daily, the London Financial Times, quote them, that the reason the elections took place was the insistence of the Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani, who vetoed 3 schemes by the U.S.-led occupation authorities to shelve or dilute elections. After failing to block the elections, Bush and Blair did not waste a moment in declaring that they intended to subvert them. Both of them, both Bush and Blair, announced at once that there would be no timetable for withdrawal of the occupation forces. Both governments are well aware that an overwhelming majority of Iraqis want the occupation forces withdrawn from their territories so strongly that even the U.S. candidate, Iyad Alawi, had to join his competitors by including this as a plank in his electoral platform. Similar conflicts persist over Iraqi resistance to the efforts by the occupying forces to impose economic arrangements, to open up the economy to take over by foreign corporations, meaning mostly U.S. and British. The strong line of continuity persists, and the struggle is far from over. Carruthers also wrote the standard scholarly work on democracy promotion in Latin America in the 1980s. In this case, he in part wrote from an insider's perspective. He served in Reagan's State Department in the programs that were called democracy enhancement. He regards these programs as sincere, though a failure, and a systematic failure. He points out that where U.S. influence was least in South America, progress towards democracy was greatest. Where U.S. influence was greatest, nearby, the regions nearby, progress was least. And he explains the reasons. In his words, the United States would tolerate only limited top-down forms of democratic change that did not risk upsetting the traditional structures of power with which the United States has long been allied. Washington sought to maintain the basic order of quite undemocratic societies and to avoid populist-based change. In short, the strong line of continuity goes back a decade earlier to its Reaganite roots. Recall that I'm not quoting a critic, but rather a leading advocate and a leading scholar of this process. In fact, the strong line of continuity goes back far beyond. Democracy promotion has always been proclaimed as a guiding vision, but it's not even controversial that the United States regularly overthrew democratic governments, often installing or supporting brutal tyrannies. This consistent practice was commonly explained by Cold War imperatives, which had little, if any, relevance, as we discover when we investigate case by case. What we do find, however, is the same strong line of continuity. Democracy is a good thing if and only if it is consistent with strategic and economic interests. None of this should elicit any surprise. The record merely reveals that the United States is very much like other powerful states, past and present, pursuing strategic and economic interests of dominant sectors. Democracy is fine as long as it takes the top-down form that does not interfere, does not risk popular interference with primary interests of wealth and power. And in fact, much the same doctrine holds internally, where enormous efforts are made, I'm quoting, to protect the minority of the opulent from the majority. That's a primary goal of government, as the framer of the American constitutional system, James Madison, explained to his colleagues at the Constitutional Convention. A popular struggle over centuries has gained many victories for freedom and democracy, but progress does not follow a smooth upward trajectory, as we see today, quite visibly in the United States, but increasingly in Europe as well, in part for similar underlying reasons. Well, I've mentioned a small sample of issues of major significance for the future, and not least among them is the propriety of the use of force. Inquiry might unearth genuine cases of intervention that are illegal but legitimate, but there is always a heavy burden of proof. The prize example offered, Kosovo, tends to reinforce the measured judgment of the World Court in 1949, reaffirmed in its Nicaragua judgment and others. and recently reiterated by the high-level UN panel. In the words of the court in 1949, the court can only regard the alleged right of intervention as the manifestation of a policy of force, such as has, in the past, given rise to most serious abuses, and such as cannot, whatever be the defects in international organization, find a place in international law. From the nature of things, intervention would be reserved for the most powerful states and might easily lead to perverting the administration of justice itself. Inquiry very definitely does reveal that state terror and other forms of threat and use of force have brought the world close to the edge of ultimate doom. Today, surely, only the most blind and irrational will ignore the call that was issued by Bertrand Russell and Albert Einstein 50 years ago, their words. Here, then, is the problem that we present to you, stark and dreadful and inescapable. Shall we put an end to the human race, or shall mankind renounce war?
Okay. Professor Chomsky, you may not be aware that we have 2 U.S. embassies in Slovenia. The first one in Slovenia is located at the very center of Ljubljana, with an official figure in the person of U.S. ambassador, while the other American embassy, quote unquote, represent books, articles, ideas all over Slovenia in civil society, libraries, and private possessions of American authors like you, late Edward Said, Susan Sontag, Norman Mailer, and many others. Which of these representations of America, Professor Chomsky, is more real and indeed representative of today's America?
Well, actually, the first comment, until I heard the rest, it reminded me of something that I was told by an old friend, a close friend, who was the major Middle East correspondent for ABC television in the United States. You've probably seen him on television. He once told me that ABC had 3 offices in Asia. One was in Japan, one was in Tel Aviv, and one was in Jerusalem. The rest of Asia was... As for the 2 American embassies, well, you know, that's really something for you to decide, but if you look closely, you will find well documented the distinction that I briefly mentioned. Namely, there is a very sharp divide between American public opinion and the consensus of the 2 political parties, the media, and the intellectual classes quite generally, on issue after issue. I mentioned a few major issues on which they're sharply divided, but it extends quite generally. And it's not reported. I mentioned that these major studies were not reported right just prior to the U.S. election, which illustrates, I think, the recognition on the part of editors that it wouldn't be a good idea to let people know that others share their opinions. People should feel isolated and helpless. And there's plenty of more evidence about this. For example, the federal budget, government's budget, was announced in February, just a month ago. And shortly after it, the most important institution in the world that monitors public opinion, an academic-based institution in the United States, carried out an in-depth study of public attitudes towards what the budget ought to be. And it turns out that attitudes are diametrically opposed to the budget on just about every issue. So a large majority of the population felt that there should be a cutback in military spending, a huge, substantial increase in social spending, more spending on support for the United Nations, more spending on foreign aid, and continues like this. Exactly the opposite of the budget that was approved by Congress in just about every major respect. Well, which is the real America? It's a complicated story. So take, for example, the war in Iraq, the invasion of Iraq. I'll just end with this example to illustrate the complexity of answering the question. About 75% of the population think it would have been wrong to invade Iraq unless Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction to use against the United States and was cooperating with Al-Qaeda to organize terrorist actions using weapons of mass destruction against the United States, similar to the September 11th bombings. So that's 75% who say the war is wrong unless that was the case. Well, even the government has long ago conceded that there wasn't any truth to those claims. Nevertheless, 50% of the public, roughly, still support the war. It looks like a contradiction until you realize that 50% of the public still believes those claims. The government media propaganda system is sufficiently powerful so that people continue to believe the claims even after it's conceded officially that they were false, and therefore support the war, which is understandable. I mean, if I believed the claims, I'd probably support the war. But that indicates how difficult it is to decide which is the real America. People's attitudes and their beliefs are often quite different. The attitudes are very similar to general European attitudes. The beliefs are often quite different, thanks to a very efficient propaganda system.
Thank you. Second question. You wrote and spoke about the responsibilities of intellectuals and their moral obligation to speak truth to power. With this in mind, I would very much appreciate if you could comment on the following. Intellectuals in Central and Eastern Europe in both the communist and post-communist times were or are still critical of Soviet Union or Russia, respectively, while at the same time rather uncritical and even adoring the USA. On the other hand, intellectuals in Latin and South America are or were critical of the USA and often ignoring the imperialism of Soviet Union or Russia, respectively. Am I correct in identifying these paradoxical and somehow asymmetric postures in this part of Europe and Latin and South America? Would be glad to hear your comment on this, framing the question.
Well, what the questioner says about Central and Eastern Europe is certainly correct, but it's not entirely accurate about Latin America. Latin American, I mean, there's a mixture in Latin America, of course, but leading Latin American intellectuals, like the 6 Jesuit intellectuals who I mentioned, who were murdered in 1989, they tended to be critical of both sides. Let me just give an illustration and you can decide what to make of it. Shortly after the 6 Jesuit intellectuals had their brains blown out by security forces armed and trained by the United States, who had just compiled a terrible record of atrocities in El Salvador, killing thousands of people. Shortly after that, a few weeks later, Václav Havel came to the United States, gave a speech to a joint session of Congress where he praised Congress as defenders of freedom and received a rousing ovation and great applause from liberal intellectuals. Just imagine that the situation were reversed. Okay? Imagine that Václav Havel and half a dozen of his associates had been assassinated by Czech security forces armed and trained by the Russians, who had just killed about 70,000 people in Czechoslovakia after having murdered an archbishop. And imagine that those Jesuit intellectuals had come to Russia, to Moscow, and addressed the Duma and had praised them as defenders of freedom. I mean, that is so inconceivable that you can't even discuss it. And it reflects the fact that Latin American intellectuals tended to sympathize with their counterparts in Eastern Europe who were indeed suffering, though not suffering anywhere near as harsh a fate as was the case in Central America in those years. So the relation is not symmetrical. And I think that's a question that people in Eastern Europe ought to ask themselves about. There's a striking difference. I suspect that the reason is that Eastern European intellectuals rightly, or any others who are suffering under Kremlin rule, quite rightly received plenty of support in the West. That's correct. They should have received it, and they did receive it. On the other hand, Latin Americans who are suffering much harsher repression under U.S. domination receive almost no support anywhere. And that's a fundamental asymmetry, and it's another thing to think about.
Let us stay with intellectuals again. Torej bomo zopet še naprej postavljali vprašanje v zvezi z intelektualci. Vprašanje se pa glasi takole. This year was proclaimed by the United Nations to be the year of Albert Einstein. I would like to ask you, Dr. Chomsky, if this great genius was close to approaching your moral imperative on the responsibilities of intellectuals, bearing in mind that Einstein greatly contributed, for the reasons of state, to the production of nuclear bomb, for what he later regretted.
Well, actually Einstein was strongly opposed to nuclear weapons. His contributions to physics did contribute to the development of nuclear weapons, but not anything that he anticipated. When it became clear that there was going to be a development of nuclear weapons, he actually opposed it. He was one of the signers of a strong statement to the president arguing against this. However, you have to remember at the time there was some ambivalence, but you have to remember the circumstances. In the early stages of World War II, it was not clear whether the Nazis were developing nuclear weapons or not. Physicists knew that they had the scientific capacity to do so. The physicists like Werner Heisenberg, for example, were among the leading nuclear physicists in the world and had the same technical knowledge as the scientists in the West. And it was not clear whether Hitler Germany, would be proceeding to develop nuclear weapons or not. Now, if Hitler had developed nuclear weapons, the consequences would be so awesome that it's impossible to discuss them. And for that reason, there was a certain degree of ambivalence about whether the United States and Britain should develop them. But as the war went along, it became quite clear that Germany was not going to be able to develop nuclear weapons, and they were in fact developed for use against Japan. Einstein was strongly opposed to that, as were a few, but not many, of the leading scientists. They continued to work on the bomb even after it was clear that Germany was going to be defeated, which is not an attractive period of Western history. After that, Einstein was a strong opponent of any form of nuclear weapons, and as I quoted, he and Russell issued a strong declaration just exactly 50 years ago, saying that unless we eliminate war and eliminate nuclear weapons, we will destroy the human species. I should say, speaking of responsibility of intellectuals, however, I don't want to criticize anyone, but there was a striking difference between Einstein and Russell, two of the leading figures of the 20th century. They had about the same views, very similar views on social and political issues, on weapons, on likelihood of destruction of the species, but they reacted very differently. Einstein made some important statements. It's very important that he made those statements. But Russell, in contrast, was on the streets, demonstrating, acting, constantly involved with popular organizations that were trying to do something about it. He was not just a person who issued pronouncements, but who also spent a large part of his life, and he was not young, in actively opposing these developments facing police and so on. And the reaction to Einstein and Russell is quite interesting. In the West, Einstein is revered. Russell was despised. He was vilified, denounced, attacked, considered a major criminal. The New York Times in particular, and others just utterly condemned and denounced him. So why violently condemn Russell but admire Einstein? I suspect the difference is that Russell was actually doing something about it. Pronouncements can be accepted, oracular pronouncements, as long as you're not doing anything to implement them. But if you begin to implement the pronouncements, then you become an object of denunciation and attack. And it's not the only case.
Probably one more question which discusses the dilemma of an intellectual. Dr. Chomsky, do you believe in the idea of ever-developing progress in human and political relationships? Or to put it more concretely, is the world of the present generations more humane? Would Russell, Sartre, Arendt envy Chomsky in this respect?
Well, to tell you the honest truth, I don't really have a lot of respect for intellectuals. History is written by intellectuals, by definition. So if you look at the history of intellectual history, they look pretty good, But you have to ask who's writing the history. If you look at the actual history, it's quite different. The actual history of intellectuals is quite sordid. Overwhelmingly, there are exceptions, but overwhelmingly intellectuals have been supporters of state violence, of terror and power atrocities and so on. There's usually a margin of dissidence, a fringe of intellectuals who condemn these crimes, and they're usually treated pretty badly. How badly they're treated depends on the society. So in El Salvador, they had their brains blown out. In Eastern Europe, in the same years, they were imprisoned and exiled. In the United States, as I say, Russell and others are vilified and denounced. But overwhelmingly, the intellectuals supported power. After all, that was true in Eastern Europe, too. There were well-known dissidents, but they were by no means the majority. Most intellectuals were subordinate to power. The same in the United States, the same almost everywhere. In fact, this goes back through history as far back as you can go. So just to take one example, which then perpetuates itself through history, take the oldest historical records, actually partly invented because it's folk history. Take the Bible, okay, and let's consider it to be a historical record. there were intellectuals. They were called prophets. The word prophet is a bad translation of an obscure Hebrew word. If you look at the prophets, they were what we would call dissident intellectuals. They were carrying out geopolitical critique of power. They were warning the kings that they were bringing disaster to the people. They were calling for justice, proper treatment of suffering people, widows and orphans and so on. They were typical of what we nowadays call dissident intellectuals. How were they treated? Well, we know from the biblical record. They were imprisoned, they were driven into the desert, they were vilified and attacked. Centuries later, many centuries later, they were honored. But that's centuries later. At the actual time of the prophets, there were others, other intellectuals who were very much honored. They were the flatterers at the court. Centuries later, they were criticized as false prophets, but not at the time. At the time, the flatterers at the court were the ones who were honored and received the privileges. The critics were very harshly treated. History's judgment centuries later was the opposite, but that's not at the time. And that pattern perpetuates itself pretty well through history. And there's a reason for it. How do you become an intellectual? I mean, it's not that you have different genes. Being an intellectual means sharing in a certain amount of privilege. You have the privilege to be able to speak to, you have training, education, resources, you can have opportunities to speak and act that most people don't have. You know, it's pretty typical for privilege and power to be associated with conformity and obedience. People who there is, throughout the whole educational system, there is a kind of selection for obedience. People who are properly obedient tend to get ahead and get to the next stage and go on to the professions and so on. People who are dissident, who just refuse, as children, let's say, to obey. People who stand up and tell the history teacher, I'm not going to do this assignment because it's too stupid. Those people tend to face problems. They're, in the United States, they're called behavior problems and maybe given pills or something like that. But there rarely are any rewards for honesty, integrity, challenge, and so on. But there are always rewards, almost always rewards for obedience and subordination. So there's a tendency over time, not 100%, but there's a tendency for those who make it to the level of intellectual prestige, there's a tendency for them to be people who have accepted the discipline imposed at every stage of a system that has hierarchy and authority, and every system has some level of that. So I don't think that there's much of a surprise. If you actually look at history, you find that this is almost always true. So take, say, the Dreyfus affair in France, which is almost the origin of modern intellectuals. Well, the way history is written, it looks as though the French intellectuals were strongly supporting Dreyfus. You look at the actual history, it was not like that at all. There was a fringe of people, like in Zola, who were defending Dreyfus. Most of them were supporting state power, but the history is reshaped. And just about everything you look at is like this. Actually, I know of a few striking exceptions. One of them I'll mention because it's quite relevant to current European policy. There's a lot of debate now, as you know, as to whether Turkey should be allowed to enter the European Union. And the argument in cultivated European circles is that they may not be advanced enough and enlightened enough to join us Europeans. The facts are almost the opposite. Turkey is one of the very few, in fact, about the only country, one of the very few countries I know of a few others, where leading intellectuals really are dissidents and face enormous risks constantly. So in Turkey, where there's plenty of crimes and atrocities, which the West supports, incidentally, the leading writers, artists, journalists, academics, not only protest atrocities and crimes, but they are constantly carrying out civil disobedience against them and facing very severe risks, sometimes enduring severe punishment. And they're doing it all the time. I don't know of anything like that in Western Europe or the United States, and very few examples in history. So actually I think Turkey has a lot to teach Western Europe about enlightened, civilized behavior. And that's not the only case. One finds the same sometimes in other third world countries. Central America was another example. So I think one has to be cautious about drawing judgments about these matters.
Let me change a little bit. Let me change a little bit the mechanics of posing the questions, and I will invite my friend here.
Hi. I'm sitting right next to Noam Chomsky, so I can't write. I just figured I could go up here. I listened to your lectures a number of times about states being the power centers and, eventually should dissolve in the future or something like that. So I was wondering if you could give us a comment about EU, because I think the young people in this country are very confused at this moment whether is it okay or not. Plus we have a quite substantial history of not ruling ourselves. I guess the other question is, do you think there are some moral standards in the repertoire of modern politicians being able to ask, like the simple questions, not everything that's supposed to be really complicated, so when in fact that should suggest it's very important for our lives? I mean the really simple questions concerning, I think, the majority of citizens in this and every other country. Thank you very much.
Well, I wouldn't suggest that human affairs are a simple matter. You can't just make decisions off the top of your head. You have to know about things and understand them and so on. On the other hand, there isn't very much depth of understanding. Human affairs are not like quantum physics, where you have to really have deep understanding and sophisticated training to understand what they're about. Most of the problems that humans face, just about everyone can understand at a sufficiently high level to make intelligent decisions about them. In some cases, you want to appeal to experts who have special knowledge, but then you have to evaluate that knowledge. So, by and large, I think with regard to the second part of the question, that most human affairs are well within the range of ordinary people's judgment and decisions. And as I suggested in the talk, at least in my opinion, the judgments of the large majority of the American people are far more sane and rational and justifiable and moral than those of the intellectual elites and the political class and the managers. As to the European Union, well, of course, Slovenia has a rather special history of being conquered by everyone and not having its empire, but most of Europe is somewhat different. The modern nation-state system was essentially developed in Europe, and it's a hideous system. That's why one of the main reasons why Europe has such a savage history in the past many centuries. A lot of the savagery of European history results from the effort to impose nation-state systems on societies where they don't make any sense at all. The societies are diverse, many cultural patterns, different languages, they cross every dimension you can think of, And the effort to impose a nation-state system on them led to wars, massacres, destruction. It's not just the 20th century, after all. The 30 Years' War probably killed 40% of the population of Germany. I mean, the entire history of Europe is barbarism and savagery. That's part of the reason why Europe was able to conquer the world. Europe was mostly a barbarian fringe of the world, remember. The centers of world civilization and both culture and economic and so on were Asia, China and India. But Europe did conquer the world primarily because it had a huge advantage in a kind of a culture of savagery and also in the techniques of warfare. Military historians often point out that in Europe, war became a science. In the rest of the world, it was kind of a hobby. You did it now and then. But in Europe, it was just a science, so they simply exterminated everyone. Most of the conflicts in the world today are the result of the efforts of European invaders to impose a nation-state system on other societies. So take the horrible wars raging in Africa. The worst is in eastern Congo, where probably 4 million people or so have been killed in the last few years, and all over the place. And the same of the major conflicts: India, Pakistan, Israel, Palestinians. Just go across the world. You have plenty of examples nearby. Those wars are, to a large extent, not completely, the result of European imposition of nation-state systems in societies and cultures where they don't make any sense, which is just about everywhere, because every part of the world is sufficiently diverse so that forcing a nation-state system on them is going to violate human rights severely. Actually, the United States and Australia are two exceptions to this. But the reason is they don't have much internal diversity the way, say, Europe does. But the reason is what I mentioned. The English invaders just exterminated the population. If you exterminate the population, you don't have diversity. So in the United States now there's basically one language, but when the colonists came, there were thousands of languages and thousands of cultures, and once you exterminate everybody, it's uniform. But short of extermination, it's extremely hard to impose a nation-state system without violence. Europe finally, in 1945, reached a point where it doesn't have any more wars. And there's a big theory in political science and international relations called the theory of the democratic peace. Goes back to Kant. The idea is that once societies become democratic, they don't make war on each other anymore. It's very hard to find any evidence for that. But what you can find evidence for is something much simpler. Once societies reach the point where they realize that the next time they have a war, it's going to be the end of everybody, then they don't have war anymore. By 1945, Europe and its offshoots had achieved levels of destructive capacity so enormous that they simply can't go to war with each other anymore. I mean, for centuries, French and Germans considered it the highest duty in life to slaughter each other, and same with the English and so on. But by 1945, that's an impossibility. They can't go to war any longer because the next time will be the end. This level of destruction is too high, so you get a move towards the European Union. And is it good or bad? Well, in my view, it has both aspects. There's a centralizing aspect to the European Union, which is dangerous. So the power of the central bank in Europe is so extreme that it's condemned even by the right-wingers in the United States. It's just too much of an attack on democracy to have that much power in an unaccountable central bank. And other aspects of European integration, like NATO, raise similar questions. On the other hand, it's a good idea to have more integration among societies and instead of sharp boundaries and conflicts and so on. So it's a good idea to be able to travel from, Slovenia to England without passing through a lot of complications, and other interchanges as well. One of the reactions to European unity, which in my view at least is pretty healthy, is the rise of a very visible increase in pressures towards regional and cultural autonomy, devolution. So in Spain, for example, Catalonia and the Basque Country, and there will soon be others, have a fair degree of autonomy and independence. I was just in Scotland a week or so ago, and Scotland now has its own parliament, still part of the United Kingdom, but it has a degree of cultural and, to a limited extent, political independence, and that's probably a good thing. It's happening over a lot of Europe, the revival of regional languages, regional cultures, some political autonomy, and so on. And it's a move towards what's sometimes called a Europe of the regions, with the nation-state system being reduced under a kind of federalism, but also more tolerance and support for diversity. I should say that a year or two ago, maybe still, I was under investigation by the Turkish state security authorities for the crime of separatism, which is a serious crime in Turkey. It was based on the fact that in a talk in southeastern Turkey, in the Kurdish areas where most of the atrocities have taken place, I said something complimentary about the Ottoman Empire. And nobody wants the Ottoman Empire back, but they had the right idea in some respects, in my opinion. So under the Ottoman Empire, there were no boundaries. You know, you could go from Cairo to Baghdad to Istanbul without crossing any border points. And furthermore, people were more or less left alone. And so within some region, maybe a city, the Greeks could run their affairs and the Armenians could run their affairs, and any other combination you like. In part it was due to the corruption of the empire. Corruption is often not a bad thing. It means there isn't too much tight supervision. But whatever the sources, I mean, it was, there's some sanity to that, and I think that kind of arrangement is probably in the long-term interests of Europe and probably most of the world, if one can move towards it. But that there is, however, one crucial fact that we can't overlook. The state system does not exist in isolation. States are not the only source of centralized power in the modern world. In fact, there's another source of centralized power, namely the corporate system, private corporations, which are huge entities. They're about as close to totalitarian as anything human beings have devised. In fact, their intellectual origins are rather similar to those of fascism and Bolshevism, the other two major forms of totalitarianism in the 20th century. They are unaccountable to almost unaccountable to the public, except for weak regulatory systems which are declining. They're immortal. They've been given fantastic rights by states to which they are tightly linked and, in fact, on which they depend, not only for defense, but even for socialization of risk and cost. For example, it's widely believed, there's an illusion in Europe and in the United States that the United States has a free enterprise economy. That's very far from true. Research and development, the costly and risky parts, typically take place in the state sector. Costs and risks are socialized, often for decades, and then handed over to the unaccountable private tyrannies that market them and so on. Well, as long as you have these predators in the society, these unaccountable, massive predators, the state system is one of the few things that protects people from them by some limits on the amount of damage they can do, some degree of social benefits, and so on. I mean, at this point, we're moving into the question of what neoliberal policies and economics are all about. But you can't discuss state systems without bringing into account the centers of private power, concentrations of private power, which are immense, international, linked to one another in all sorts of strategic alliances and relying closely allied to the powerful states. So it's a complicated world system. And in my view, all of these systems of power should be dissolved and put in under popular control, but that's a long process.
Noam, you have got two questions on Kosovo problem. I will try to join them. First one, why are you talking about the NATO bombing of Kosovo? It was a bombing of the whole state of Yugoslavia, and Kosovo was only the small part of the bombing. And the second related question, what is your suggestion for the solution of the Kosovo problem? Should Serbian government give it the independence, but would this start a domino effect in other critical regions?
Well, the first part is quite right. It wasn't the bombing of Kosovo, it was the bombing of Serbia. And the worst bombing was not in Kosovo. Maybe I wasn't clear about that, but the atrocities that were the consequence of the bombing took place in Kosovo, as was anticipated. It was anticipated that the bombing would lead the Serbian authorities to carry out atrocities in Kosovo, which of course they did. But the bombing was Serbia, that's correct. Belgrade, other centers in Serbia, and it was criminal. In fact, the international tribunal, there is an international tribunal, as you know, on Yugoslavia. A group of international lawyers approached the tribunal with evidence about NATO crimes and asked the tribunal to investigate them. The NATO crimes were compiled from the leading human rights organizations in the world, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, and also from admissions by the NATO command. They conceded it. The prosecutors of the tribunal refused to consider them in violation of the tribunal rules and stated that they would just take NATO's assertions of good faith seriously without looking at them. Now, that's outrageous. I should say that Yugoslavia, after the tribunal wouldn't look at these crimes, Yugoslavia brought them to the World Court, which considered them for about 5 years. They just recently stated that they don't have jurisdiction. But there was an interesting event that took place when Yugoslavia brought the case to the World Court, very revealing event, which was barely mentioned in the United States or Europe. In the United States, not at all. The United States withdrew from the proceedings right away. All the other NATO powers remained under investigation by the World Court. The United States withdrew on interesting grounds. The Yugoslav case was based in part on the Genocide Convention. And the United States did sign the Genocide Convention after 40 years. It was one of the last countries to sign it. But the United States signed the Genocide Convention with a reservation, saying it is inapplicable to the United States. Okay. So therefore, the U.S. government, this is Clinton now, not Bush, approached the court and said, you don't have jurisdiction because the World Court rules are that they only have jurisdiction when both sides agree. And the United States is excluded from the Genocide Convention, which means, taking it literally, that the U.S. reserves the right to carry out genocide. Well, the court correctly excluded the United States, which is worth thinking about. Putting that aside, yes, it was Serbia that was bombed, not Kosovo, that's correct. What's the proper solution? Well, you can sort of guess from what I said before. My own feeling is that there should be a kind of a right of autonomy and secession almost anywhere. Of course, it has consequences, and you have to take into account the consequences. Things don't happen in isolation. The Western powers, the NATO powers, have insisted that Kosovo remain as part of Serbia. That's at the insistence of NATO and the West. And I don't think that it's right in principle, but their reasoning is intelligible. The reasoning is exactly what the questioner said, that if Kosovo becomes independent, it could have a domino effect. There could be an effect throughout the Balkans. In Macedonia, and, the Albanian minority will ask for independence in Macedonia, and who knows what else will happen. And the whole very complicated and painful situation might unravel and become a lot worse. So those are simply consequences that have to be thought through. But in the longer term, I think the right answer is essentially autonomy. How it should, maybe in some federal Balkan system or something like
that. Next few questions, because we are nearing to the end.
Yeah.
Dear Professor Chomsky, how would you comment the recent Orange Revolution in Ukraine and the current events in Kyrgyzstan? Would you say there are strong West forces behind it, with the USA as the master of puppets? Thank you. Thank you.
The first was Ukraine and the second was Kyrgyzstan?
Kyrgyzstan.
Yeah.
Yes,
Mm-hmm. In the Ukraine, there's no controversy about it. I mean, the West, the United States in particular, but the West altogether was very heavily involved in the Orange Revolution, so-called. What's going on is pretty clear. Ukraine is split. There's a part that partly on class lines, partly on geographical lines, and so on. It's a sphere of traditional Russian influence. That's not to justify it, just to assert it. And for Russia, it has a lot of strategic significance. I mean, the fleet, the Black Sea Fleet is based there. It has industrial and weapons installations and so on. The West would very much prefer to have Ukraine move into the West. It's worth remembering that back 15 years ago, when the Soviet Union was collapsing, George Bush, President Bush #1, promised Gorbachev that if nothing was done forcefully to prevent the Soviet Union from collapsing into separate states, the United States would not move to incorporate would not move the borders of NATO eastward to threaten the Soviet Union, would not incorporate any of the seceded regions into NATO. Well, of course, that didn't happen, or into the Western sphere of influence. The U.S. backed down on that promise. So the Soviet Union did collapse, good thing, but the U.S. continued to expand its military system to be even more threatening to the Soviet Union, which is having very dangerous effects in the world. In fact, it's increasing the threat of nuclear war and so on. And Ukraine is a case in point. I mean, people in Ukraine should... It was clear that the first election was fraudulent and the second election was more honest. But that doesn't change the fact that major efforts were made by the West, primarily the United States, to support the forces they wanted to win. After that, you can make your own judgments. As for Kyrgyzstan, I don't think the West is involved, and I don't think the United States likes it particularly. There's a lot of maneuvering for power in the Central Asian region. It has resources. Kyrgyzstan itself doesn't have much, but the surrounding states do. And there's a good deal of tension between the United States, Russia, China, other Western powers as to who's going to get control over those resources. Where are the pipelines going to go, for example? I don't have to go into the Chechnya affair is related to this. Everything in the Caucasus is related. It doesn't have much to do with the interests of the people. It has to do with who's going to get control of the resources and thereby have more strategic power in the world. And at the moment, I think the U.S. would probably prefer that the Kyrgyzstan affair be settled quietly. If there's some new dictator, they won't care any more than they care in Uzbekistan, where the dictator is a close friend of George Bush's, and the U.S. doesn't care that he takes care of dissidents by boiling them to death in boiling water. it's okay as long as it stays quiet and the resources are going to the west, and it's a base for it's a U.S. military base for Central Asian operations and so on. And I suspect Kyrgyzstan is more or less the same.